Hello everyone. Title of this next presentation is Document Co-Citation Analysis of the Translation and Interpreting Research, Implications for Assessment and Pedagogy. I'm Neil Ryder. I'm going to be hosting this event. Just to remind you, it's being recorded. And if you have any questions for our presenters, you can post them in the chat and I'll ask them at the end of the presentation. Our two speakers today are Vahid Aryadust and Zhu Shuilian. Vahid is an assistant professor of language assessment literacy at the National Institute of Education of Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He has led a number of language assessment research projects and has also co-authored a number of book chapters and books. Vahid's areas of interest include language assessment, neurocognition and comprehension, eye tracking, and quantitative data analysis. Zhu Shuilian is a PhD student from the National Institute of Education at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Her previous experiences in teaching and professional practice led to her current research in translation and interpreting studies, specializing in using cutting-edge technology to conduct interpreting process research. Shuilian has publications on EFL learning and quantitative research studies on the validation of language assessment for academic purposes. So if our presenters are ready to start, then I'll hand things over now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. I'll present by providing a very brief overview. I was wondering if you could go back to the previous slide, Julian. So I just want to present the title of this presentation is a co-citation analysis of translation and interpretation research. As you know, translation and interpreting has become a very important research research cluster, and a lot of researchers are investigating the cognitive processes of translators and interpreters. What we're doing in this project is we looked into literally any available research paper or book that has been published and been indexed in big databases like Scopus or the Web of Science. What we did was to use a document co-citation analysis method to cluster those studies and to see what kind of themes will emerge from these investigations. So our approach is kind of different from other approaches in which an investigator will look for a very small number of papers and then we'll go through them and code them. Our coding has been done by a kind of machine learning approach. So Shuilian is going to present the main bulk of this research, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll be happy to help her to answer the questions. Over to you, Shuilian.
Hey, thank you very much, Dr. Vahid. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. We're going to unpack the topic in the following 5 sections. And in the literature part, we will highlight 3 terms. One is translation and interpreting. And second one is the study of translation and interpreting. And third one, we will bring you to some previous TS reviews. As mentioned by Dr. Vahid, translation and interpreting are also known as written and spoken translations, respectively. They have played essential roles in promoting trade, religion, and scholarship exchanges in history. For example, on the left, you can see the earliest graphic depiction of the interpreter talking to both sides. That's one person talking to both sides. And now, in translation and interpreting has become a booming industry in the 21st century, widely used in international organizations, NGOs, or other business and political occasions. And due to its high demand, translation and interpreting has entered formal education at both undergraduate and graduate levels. Famous institutions in this area, including our university, NTU in Singapore, University of Bath, University of Westminster in UK, Middlebury Institute of International Studies in US, to really just name a few. As to the application of translation and interpreting, we could have a look at the website of the Supreme Court of Singapore. Here are the services provided by the interpreting agency of the Supreme Court of Singapore. Here, Chinese language Chinese languages are translated from each other, and it is called intralingual translation or interpreting. And Chinese languages are also translated and interpreted back and forth to other languages, which is interlingual translation. So the wide application of translation and interpreting also arouse the interests of scholars. And translation and interpreting studies is an academic discipline that deals with the complex problems surrounding the phenomenon of translation and interpreting. Holmes, in 1988, proposed a tripartite model including, three areas. They are descriptive studies, applied studies, and theoretical studies, attempting to present a kind of atlas of TS. Given that TS has undergone fundamental changes in its paradigms, models, and methodologies, Holmes' map or atlas may not fully represent current research and innovations. Researchers thus began to review TS with different methods. Here is a summary of these studies in the 21st century, and these scholars really made rigorous studies employing various analysis methods and covered different time spans. Although these aforementioned studies have been very important in shaping our understanding of this knowledge domain in TS, the scope of investigation and research methods, as Dr. Vahid mentioned, can and should be enhanced. There have been always a calling for statistic methods engaging in the review. So we formulated the following two research questions. The first one is, what are the dominant research trends in TS in the 21st century? And second one is, what implications can be drawn for pedagogy in translation and interpreting programs? And here is our data source. Our data source, when we chose our data source, we kind of rely on these three criteria, which are the reliability, the representativeness, and the volume. Therefore, we chose 13 journal articles, and we withdraw almost 6,000 journal articles from these 13 core journals covering different aspects of translation and interpreting studies. And we also employed scientometrics, which is the key method in our study. And as to scientometrics, I would like to give you a comparison and you would understand it ASAP. If you look at the left, that would be a map of Singapore. From this map, we understand, or we come to know the buildings, roads, lakes, and other geographic characteristics of this country. But if you look at the right side, that would be a knowledge map of TS. And from this map, you can see the important authors, publications, and other important information. So scientometrics can systematically analyze and visualize a domain knowledge for us. And we employed one important sub-method of scientometrics, which is document co-citation analysis in our study. As to document co-citation analysis, I would like to point out the graphic on the right. On the right, C, D, E are three journal articles. They cite A and B. A and B hence are called cited papers, and C, D, E are called citing papers. The more C, D, E, if we have C1, C2, C3, or D1, D2, D3, and then they accumulated to become a cluster. So according to Dr. Chen Chaomei, he said DCA compared to other co-citation analysis could offer a network of references which are easier to identify and interpret. we used the software developed by Dr. Chen Chaomei and his team, which is called CiteSpace. And we also employed a number of indices embedded in the software to decide the novelty, duration of influence, the confidence of network interpretation. And these indices were used to do network comparison. Later, I will introduce how we compare the networks and generated the network we want. Okay, so here is the network construction and comparison. Before comparing and selecting the best or the optimal network, we set up different parameters here in two interfaces. One is properties. The other one is selection criteria. That means we didn't just accept the default model. We actually took an active role in selecting and comparing the networks by kind of mix match the different criteria. So after that, we generated 12 networks. And due to the space limit, I just copied and pasted the important indices of these 6 networks here on this slide. But remember, we actually compared 2 of them. Finally, we chose this one, which is set up at G-index K50, and the modularity Q and mean CNUIT scores are relatively high, which indicates the confidence of the software to construct the network. So we chose this one to generate our result. As to the result, I would like to introduce the time view first. The time view can give us some very important information in our network. For example, here in this green circle, there are some spotlight, and they represent the spotlight in the TS research history. And on the upper side, we can see the time marks. So from this timeline view, we can easily see the ups and downs of those clusters. Oh, by the way, clusters referring to those ones, and the software has cleverly labeled them as follows. For example, this one, professional identity, if I may, I would like to draw your attention to this third cluster, professional identity. We can see it has been drawing attention from the scholars around 2004 and 2007, and gradually lost its influence in research. It doesn't mean it's not important. Maybe in 2004, 2007, it was under the controversial status, I mean the professional identity. So it has been widely discussed in that period. But later on, when people recognized this question is settled down, they no longer conducted such wide discussion. So that's how timeline view can tell us. And besides that, timeline view also revealed the so-called research frontiers. And how can we tell they are research frontiers? We can see the spotlight here, the circles here representing the research spotlight. They are kind of took place in recent years after 2016. And through this, we can say, number 1, lingua franca, number 2, Mercian translation, and number 4, interpreting student. They can be called the research frontiers of TS, of translation and interpreting studies. Besides time view, we also generated the burstness, which has strongest citation in history. For example, the second one, Turwey, his work, Descriptive Translation, has drawn widely interest of citation. So its strength reached over 12, which is really impressive. But the latter part, I mean, this part on the right are similar to the time view. It can tell us the rise and fall of those citations. For example, the one I've mentioned, it enjoyed popularity after 2003, and it lasted about like 3 or 4 years, and gradually not that strongly cited. But later on, some other words like translation and globalization, this one has drawn our attention for longer period and in latter stage. So this is how robustness tells us about the knowledge domain. As to the possible implications, of course, when we conducted the discussion, we always bear some questions in our mind. How does our result contribute to pedagogy? How does it inform students, and how students can learn from our research? Besides students, we also want to give implications to lecturers, professors, and researchers. We also want to give some implications for them. Again, just a little bit reminding, our research frontier identified as follows: lingua franca, immersion translation, and interpreting student. Since interpreting student is closely related to the theme of this conference, we would like to introduce this one in detail. For interpreting student, it has enjoyed popularity in research since 2012, and it has still enjoys its momentum until the present day. It is a large cluster because we can see there are 117 cited publications and 37 citing articles in it, and the seniority score is relatively high. After coding those papers in this cluster, we have put them under 3 themes. One is technology, second is assessment, and third one is methodology. For technology part, this author, Vilgemma, in 2018, used Learn Perform, which is a kind of dialogue interpreting simulation to train the interpreter students with replicated authentic communication situations. I think it is very useful, especially under the COVID-19 situation. We have no real situation or scenarios for students to have field practice. So this kind of simulations are very useful for students. And for assessment, Poach Hacker, if you happen to be in this field, you know Poach Hacker is a master or kind of great mind in interpreting and translation assessment. And besides him, other researchers also developed in this area, like Bolanos and his colleague developed a translation self-efficacy scale, TSE, which is proved very useful in assessing translation interpreting students. Actually, in this lane, besides assessing students, the scholars also suggest we should provide continuous assessment for field interpreters and translators to guarantee the quality in the work. As to methodology, Russell in 2014 conducted a longitudinal study on the predictive ability of paraphrase. Paraphrase is widely used in translation and interpreting training, and he conducted a longitudinal study to prove that this is really very useful in the language rendition. Okay, so that's the first spotlight we want to draw attention to. The other two, I will save some words, but they are equally important. For example, machine translation. Machine translation is different from computer-assisted translation. Machine translation is basically a linguistic activity mainly undertaken by machines, with humans maybe acting as subordinates, but computer-assisted translation means humans are the main body, but machines can assist humans. So due to its nature of automatic translation, machine translation has introduced interdisciplinary research in TS. It also introduced some implications for pedagogy. For example, as I've mentioned, machine translation is mainly undertaken by machines. So the education institutions began to provide post-editing courses for the students. That means after machine translation, the students are trained to edit and improve the text generated by machines. This is a kind of trend in modern translation and interpreting educational institutions. Besides that, we also have lingua franca, English as lingua franca as a research frontiers. This is kind of dilemma because English as lingua franca indicates a predominance of English language and a weakening of other languages. It is kind of on the other side of translation and interpreting, because translation and interpreting promotes the notion of retaining the influence of different native languages and achieving successful communication through language mediators. So the concept of ELF actually poses challenges to TS practices and theories. But because of this challenge, TS, the scholars also began to think how to adopt this trend. Therefore, they began to design the different pedagogy approaches to accommodate these new developments, like how to optimize the TS research methodologies or kind of emphasis on non-linguistic trainings for the students. But the focus would be shifted to something like social contextual factors in translation and interpreting. So challenges also brings about opportunities. And to sum up our study, first of all, the findings of our study do not support Holmes' distinction between these three aspects of studies in translation and interpreting studies. Instead, it supports a dichotomy of qualitative and quantitative studies, because when we co-did some papers, we found that they could be called descriptive, and they always started from descriptive or applied studies and then extended to theoretical studies. It's hard to classify them into one of them or even two of them. So qualitative and quantitative studies, this dichotomy suit them much better. And second, we also carried out a network comparison to identify the optimal model, which is, which is kind of future trend in using the software. We don't just passively accept the default model, we actively do comparison by ourselves. And third, the use of scientometrics, especially DCA, document co-citation analysis, allow us to describe or kind of draw a map for the knowledge domain of TS. It provides the kind of clear guideline for future researchers. And finally, through the identified frontiers, as I've introduced, we have implications guiding the pedagogical and assessment design. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I stop sharing.
Yeah, you can stop sharing now. So see if there's any questions in the chat. And I have a couple questions while we're waiting to see if anything is in the chat. First question is a very short one. It's just, I noticed one of the clusters was called War Zone. I was wondering what that's referring to. It was cluster 5.
Yes, thank you very much for attending that. This is actually a cluster which I'm very interested in, because in war zone, many interpreters and translators work in war zones, but they face one crisis, which is identity crisis, because they are always hired by one of the parties in their war zone. So whether they should serve as neutral language mediators or whether they should serve as the spokesman of the one who hired them, that's the dilemma they always face too. So the international organizations of, the International Association of Interpreters always call for the neutral position of those war zone interpreters or translators. But the truth is, to be frank, those pay for them actually have say on the point of view. So this is a kind of a heated discussion among the interpreting scholars. We are still looking for a solution. It's really a dilemma. Thank you for pointing it out.
Another question was about growth of machine translation, more a general question, not just specifically about your study, but in your field. Do you see machine translation as growing and improving quality to the level that there'll be less demand for human translators? Like, is translation not a field, not a growth field for younger people who are looking for employment?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. Actually, I myself have such kind of experience. I remember last year in a conference called Smart Expo, which showcases the smart technology, the most advanced smart technology in the market. And one of the companies called iFlatech, which is I think one of the most famous one in natural language processing and the machine translation. And I was lucky to be the simultaneous interpreters for them. At that moment, when I was doing simultaneous interpreting for them, I found that there were two screens in front of me. One is the natural language processing, which means that they use their machine to write down what I say on the screen. But that was on the left. But on the right, there was a screen, which is the auto translation, which is machine translation. They interpreted the speakers directly. So that means I have a competitor on the spot. How do I solve this problem? Or I felt like I was in a fierce competition with the machine. But later on, I found three interesting phenomena. First of all, when the speakers speak in the local dialects, the machine cannot catch up with them. That means the speakers are supposed to speak in very standard local not local language, but Mandarin or English, but definitely not from some like accent. Definitely must be very formal and standard. So I felt like, okay, what a relief. And second, I have to admit that sometimes I cannot understand or I cannot find the proper equivalence from Chinese to English or from English to Chinese. At that time, as an interpreter, I always go around the bush to find out some explanations. But with the machine translation assisting me, I could just pick at the screen and find out how it translated or interpreted it, and I borrowed that word. So I came to a conclusion that machine translation is not our enemy. Instead, machine translation can empower translators and interpreters. We don't have to regard them as enemies. That's my understanding.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Last question was just, did you think about translation of written texts? That's something that machines would be able to do more completely than humans. Like you mentioned, like specifically about like dialects and accents that the machine can't really pick up on. But if you're just translating like a formal academic text, do you think in the future that could be 100% automated?
In the future, I cannot say, but nowadays, just like I mentioned, we have implemented a course, post-editing course in different language training or translation and interpreting programs. That's because the result of machine translation is not satisfying. That's why we need humans to edit it after machine translation. But in the future, with the enlarge of corpus, I'm not sure, even for interpreters, with the enlarge of corpus, I'm not very sure, but still at present, in the near 10 or 20 years, I don't think I can lose my job. So I don't have to worry about it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I just noticed the time is up now. Sorry, there's no other questions from the chat. So there's going to be a plenary discussion starting in 10 minutes in the plenary room. I'm going to close this room down in a minute and stop the recording. So you got about 10 minutes. And then everyone's going to gather again for the final events of the conference. So thank you to Vahid and to Shuilin for attending today and for this interesting presentation. And I'll just sign off now. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you. Bye.